Sunila, welcome to Inside Albania. You will have heard this week the tragic incident which happened where a 14-year-old boy, he was stabbed outside a school in central Tirana. In the UK, we have problems like this, you know, and in the US as well, obviously. But this incident really shocked Albania because, I mean, things like this have sort of happened before, but not like this. There've been protests. It's really shocked society. And I can't get my head around a 14-year-old resorting to such violent acts and also being in possession of a knife as well. And I just wanted to ask you, I mean, from your perspective, you are Albanian, you are a psychologist, you also live in the US, so you are around sort of this more violent environment in a way. I don't want to generalize, but I'm wondering if you can help me shed some light on the psychology behind how we've got in this situation.
Well, first and foremost, condolences to the family. I'm so sad for that 14-year-old boy. As a mom of a teenager, I can only imagine. However, this is more common than we want it to be. So it's not that I wasn't surprised, but it's not something that I was not expecting it either. The reason for that is complicated. It needs a lot of context, but gender, it's a knife, it's not a gun. Trauma, maybe abuse going on in the family. And what I really want to stress for my community, especially as the founder of Care for Albania, which focuses specifically on mental health, is the trauma that our community has had for years. We've had 45 years of isolation and communism, and then 35 years of transition. So the transition, although we're doing great strides, we need to focus on our mental health piece. So if there is one child that is troubled, the whole community is troubled. And in this case, you can see it, how the community is really upset about what happened.
But I can't help but think as well, and I mean, we've discussed previously, and I agree with you on this sort of generational trauma that exists in Albania, you know, from communism, from the transition, from 97, all this repressed anger and resentment. It gets passed down 2 generations and things. And then you throw in the mix something like social media. I mean, Prime Minister Edi Rama has said he wants to look at ways to limit, if not ban, access to social media for adolescents. And I'm completely with him on this. I think some of the things that you come across in social media are terrifying, and you have this young mind which is growing up in this complex situation, easily influenced, and then they're sitting on social media and they have access to this content that glamorizes drugs, violence, gangsters, aggression, toxic masculinity, you know, and I think this has to have an impact on the youth as well, especially in this unique Albanian context. What are your views on the social media use among youth? Do you think banning it for people under 18 is a possible solution?
I mean, first and foremost, I think 18 is a little bit too old because you can't really control someone at 18 years old and say, but I do think that Australia has a law or they're actually working on one, 16 and under, where they don't have their ban in electronics. I don't know how much this is going to work psychologically because sometimes when you take something away, people want to like just put their hands into. But I have more of a softer solution. What I've seen here in US and with my kids and what it happens, a lot of the kids have phones nowadays, which I absolutely agree. I wish that the phones were not part of their lives because it is the biggest drug. They tend to, we all actually tend to focus too much on scrolling. And if you're not wise enough, which I don't expect a teenager or a child to be wise enough, then of course we have the algorithms that whatever you're watching is going to increase. So if someone is already troubled as a teen and they're watching something that includes violence, now those violent acts are going to pop up. One thing that I've been really surprised with my kids' school actually is that even though they have electronics, they take electronics away from morning until 5 o'clock. And then it's the parents' responsibility what they do after, which as a parent, I'd lie if I were to say that I cannot, I haven't had a conflict with my child when it comes to electronics. But I think it's really important for parents and children to communicate and to increase awareness how this is a problem with the community, not just with kids. And lead by example. If I am on the phone all day, I can't tell my child not to be, because eventually they're going to sneak around and go and get it.
Yeah, but I can't help, I have a daughter. There are times I've given her the phone, maybe I've had an interview. I've been at home and she's been off school and I've had an interview and I've had to give her the phone or whatever. And I swear I can tell a difference in the way she interacts with me after she uses a phone for a certain
Yeah.
amount of time, after she
Yeah.
uses, like, she doesn't engage. It takes her some time to get back to her normal self, like how she interacts. She's a bit snappy, a bit sort of like moody. It's weird, this effect has on her. So this, and as well, sometimes I feel that this time that kids are spending on their phones after school, at the weekends, etc., that is time that previously would have been filled with parenting. And I think if your kid is in their room on a tablet, and you as a parent, you are not having that time with them, you're not engaging with them, you're not teaching them, you're not correcting their path, you're not figuring out if they've got something going on, if there's some problem, you're not noticing changes in their behavior or their mood or their demeanor because you're not communicating with them. We have a generation now which is being raised by social media and by screens, not with the same level of attention that parents used to give before. I'm not blaming the parents for what happened yesterday, this earlier this week. That's not the case. But I think I worry that if we continue down this path of parents being so detached from their kids, that things like this are more likely to happen because parents are just not going to notice the warning signs.
Absolutely. But I also think it's important to stress that it is a way to disconnect, right? So if the parent is isolated and it doesn't have help and is a single parent or both parents are working, it's impossible to actually ask that parent to just be on 24/7.
Yes.
So we need to work on a community. What I've noticed, I mean, I was born and raised there. I grew up there. So what I noticed is that at the time I had my grandmother and my grandfather being more engaged and my aunts and everyone else. And here in US is very similar. When you're a parent, it can be very lonely
Yes.
because you have to do it all on your own. So that is one issue. The other issue is I want to stress what you mentioned about with your daughter. When kids are on the phone, the outcome when you take the phone away, which I would always suggest at least prepare their brains 5 more minutes and that's it, and be boundaried. But even if you did that, the side effects of a phone is exactly like a drug.
Yeah.
I mean, kids are irritable, they're angry, they don't take this away. So this is what I want to stress the most for our community, that phones can be extremely addictive. And it is like you're giving your kid cocaine or heroin. And I hate to say this, but as someone that has worked in substance abuse for so many years, it's extremely dangerous. So you need to have some type of balance with these phones. Also, what I mentioned earlier is that if these phones can take you anywhere in the world, now you're exposed to the whole world and to anyone that's dangerous and wants to do bad things, right? So this is also the difference in Albania, because before, not only in Albania, but I'm sure even in UK, I don't know if you had an iPhone at a young age, but I remember here in US, I had like
Too
a
old.
dinky phone, Nokia, which I love. Um, and that didn't give me that much access. Now kids have access to everything. So if the brain is developing, if this kid is troubled, if his kid has been neglected or abused, if there is domestic violence in the family, even if that doesn't happen, let's say that this kid just scrolls, that will pop up. That's why this is so important. It's a drug. It's important for parents to regulate. It's important for their parents to model that, and teachers and anyone around. And how can we come together as a community to better our community? Because right now, yes, we have 35 years of democracy, but what that means is that from a complete isolation, now you're kind of like open to
Overload.
an oyster of, the whole thing. And it is our responsibility to put boundaries around. That does not mean that you have to be beating your kids up or yelling
beat
at them, you know, not an authoritarian way, but the parents should have enough voice to say, look, let's sit on the table, especially with teens. You know, I have an 11-year-old. He's a preteen or a full-on teen, but I usually talk to him. I say, okay, what is our agreement? We sit on the table, we discuss it. We've agreed that he uses the phone for 2 hours a day, and then the phone is turned off. That is completely normal. Now, because of this tragedy, I don't really want to make it all about the phone. Again, I want to stress trauma. I want to stress, I don't know how this kid is raised, the one that was stabbing. I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is true, but I read that, you know, this poor child was stabbed 6 times. What it really tells me is that the other child that did this act, this you know, hateful act, was probably in a state of trauma. To just go and do that over and over and over again.
It's not just
you're
a
not in the
one
right
time.
mind.
Yeah.
And then you stopped because you freaked out. It's like you kept on going, which the child is in a trance. And I want to call this person a child because if he was a 14-year-old,
It's a child.
you're still a child.
Yes,
the brain is not developed until we're 23. If you're lucky enough
Or
to have
older in
healthy
some
parents
cases.
and you've done your work. Yes, or we're still growing.
Yeah.
All of us.
I mean, I wanted to ask as well, you know, in the US, in the UK as well, it's not, maybe, okay, they're much bigger countries, but these things do happen more regularly, it seems. I mean, it happened when I was living in the UK, I knew there were cases, and in inner cities in the UK, they have metal detectors in schools, so you have to pass through a metal detector to enter the school. Staff, some have security. You are allowed to be searched on the school premises as a student, like they have the right to search you. And this is a whole new world in a way for Albania, you know, the thought of having to do this. I remember there was talk a while ago of having security at schools and people were quite shocked about it. But now they're sort of in the streets blaming the government, blaming the police, blaming this, blaming that. And I'm just wondering where we go from here. You know, I don't think it's the government's fault. I don't think it's the police's fault. I think everyone in society has a part to play in when it comes to sharing blame for situations like this. But I'm just, instead of blaming, I'm wondering how do we go forward from here? How can we, I don't think we can prevent things like this from happening, but what can we do to try and prevent things like this from happening at an individual level?
Well, first and foremost, I think that the idea of blaming is just ridiculous because you're only going to perpetuate the problem. I'm not saying that people should not be accountable, but to go on the streets and start saying the police or the government and all that, it almost becomes politicized. So I think it has to start within us, within ourselves. You know, I was really shocked when I noticed that people were walking by, and I don't know how true this is, by the way, so please correct me, because I don't live there and I haven't been there in a while, but people were walking by and they did not do anything. That does not necessarily mean because people didn't care. It can also mean that people were afraid.
Yeah.
And they didn't know what was going on, right? So there are two sides of this story. The other thing is, once you start getting on the streets and being angry and requesting some type of change, it's almost to me like you're saying, it's your problem, not mine. We have to start with ourselves if we want to see a change. You know, I will start with my own child and say, look, this happened. I actually had this conversation with my kid and said, this is what happened in Albania. And I really think that it could be stress and it could be so many things and phones and knives. Why would people do this? Just so he can be aware that not only this happens, but how can you not do this? And how can you not pretend, but protect the other kid if something like that happened, right? So it starts within the family. It should not start on the street. Who am I to tell? But as a psychologist, that's what I'd start.
Yes.
Family, community, small communities, school, and then you can actually require a change to change the policies, such as banning the cell phones for 16 and under, which I think is completely doable if we come across as the world, not only one country. The other part, I think you mentioned something, you know, what can we do in this situation? I really do think that mental health is very, very important here because there is no way that this person was in the right mindset. And if a child has been neglected and abused, these are some of the outcomes.
Yes.
So what we can also do is introduce, and I don't know how it is in Albania. I know it's limited, the mental health piece, limited in education, limited in psychologists and how much they know and the training that they need, but also limited on the clients going. I mean, I
Yes.
see Albanians even here in Chicago and in US being resistant to some
Yes.
degree to it.
There's a
So
stigma as
Care
well.
for yeah, it's stigma. And Care for Albania is the first mental health organization in US for Albanian American community. Now, I know we have mental health providers in Albania. I just don't know how much work they're doing because of the limitations of what I
We
mentioned earlier.
we have the lowest ratio of psychiatrists per capita in Europe as well. It's a really bad situation. There's a stigma around it. People don't seek help. So even
Well,
I think it begins with talking to your kids. Talk to your kids. You have to find out what's going on with them so you can notice the changes in their mood, their behavior. Talk to their teachers. I hope my daughter won't be angry with me for sharing this, but she had some issues in school a few months ago where she was behaving not well with the other kids. So that required significant work with her at home, conversations, discussions, little role playing, incentives and punishments and things. It required significant work to work through that period with her. But I was only aware of what was going on because I sit and talk to her every night and I try. I'm not saying I'm a perfect parent, I'm not at all, but unless you're talking to your kids and are prepared to
no,
put in
nobody is.
sorry?
Yeah. No, I was saying nobody is a perfect parent because we really don't know what kind of child you have, the
Yeah.
temperament, and the issues that come up in this day and age, which are very different from what we had. So I'm sounding like my mom. During my time, this did not happen. So we're dealing with new issues. However, I also do think that the communication between the parent and the child, but most importantly, is the parent doing their own work to be healthy?
Yes.
Because if the parent is not attuned to their own needs, they're not going to look at their kid emotionally, their emotional needs. I mean, I think that Albanian parents are excellent parents when it comes to basic needs, food, taking care, giving, trying to give what you need. When it comes to emotional, psychological, you have to do your own work
Yeah.
in order to actually raise a child
Yes.
that's psychologically healthy.
Yes.
So I had to do my own work as an Albanian to actually raise healthier kids and break that cycle. So I wouldn't even go straight to the child. I would go to the parents and to the teachers and to mental health providers. Are they healthy? Are they doing their work? Instead of saying, I'm a psychologist. I usually tell people this all the time. I'm a psychologist and I have done my work. I have my own people that help me because we're all breakable. And this is how we break the stigma in our community. So start with yourself, talk to your child, talk to the teacher. Communication piece, for example, is really complicated because it's not that people don't know how to talk, it's that people don't know how to put emotions into
Yeah.
words.
Yeah. This is
And what
very.
happens to the brain when you're really frustrated with your child or with a teacher, for example, or the teacher with a child? The first thing that happened is the language goes out of the window, and then you tend to kind of like go into like punishment, or it's normal, it's
Yeah.
normal, and that's okay. But how do you really calm yourself? Like, one of the things that I do with my kids is, instead of giving them timeouts and putting them in a room, I take timeouts. I say, I am going to calm myself down and come back and be in charge of this
Just
situation.
going to take a note of that for my own use. Mummy's going for timeout. See you tomorrow.
Yes, it's a win-win.
Yes. Sunila, thank you very much. Thank you for your expertise, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.